Number 5. George Angel Rivas Jr. There was a note left behind, scrawled and deliberate. It read, "You haven't heard the last of us yet." That message was found inside the John B. Connolly unit on December 13, 2000, the morning after 7 of Texas's most dangerous inmates walked out the front door. The ringleader was George Angel Rivas Jr., a man already serving 18 consecutive life sentences who had somehow convinced 7 other prisoners that freedom was still possible. For Rivas, escape wasn't desperation, it was architecture. Born in El Paso, Texas on May 6, 1970, George Rivas showed early signs of a mind built for manipulation. By the time he was in his late 20s, he had accumulated convictions for 13 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 4 counts of aggravated robbery, and 1 count of burglary of habitation. The courts had effectively sentenced him to die in prison without ever formally putting him on death row, so Rivas decided to write his own ending. The escape took months to plan. Rivas hand-picked every member of the group, selecting inmates he believed he could control and who had the specific skills he needed. On the day of the breakout, the 7 men overpowered prison workers with methodical precision. They stole their clothing, they broke into the armory and took weapons, they modified a prison truck with a false bottom to conceal their movement. Then they drove away. No alarm was raised in time, no pursuit followed immediately. 7 of Texas's most violent convicted felons had simply vanished into the afternoon. What followed was 11 days of silence, and then Christmas Eve. The group had drifted north through Texas, funding their movement through a series of armed robberies. On the night of Christmas Eve 2000, they targeted an Oshman's sporting goods store in Irving, Texas. The robbery netted over $70,000 in cash, 44 firearms, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Then, Officer Aubrey Hawkins arrived. He was 29 years old, a husband, a father, a cop responding to an alarm call on Christmas Eve.
Hawkins was shot 11 times, then run over. He was dead before he hit the pavement. The Texas 7, as they were now known, fled to Colorado, where they posed as traveling missionaries in an RV park near Colorado Springs. A neighbor recognized them after watching the case profiled on America's Most Wanted. A SWAT team surrounded the park on January 22, 2001. One member of the group, Larry Harper, shot himself rather than surrender. The others were taken into custody. The trials were separate, but the outcomes uniform. All surviving members were convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Rivas, as the acknowledged mastermind, drew particular prosecutorial focus. In the courtroom, he reportedly told jurors he deserved death, though observers debated whether this was remorse or performance. Rivas spent over a decade on death row before his execution date arrived. On February 29, 2012, a date that only exists on the calendar every 4 years, George Rivas received his lethal injection at the Walls unit. He was 41 years old. His final statement included an apology to the Hawkins family and words of love for his wife. More than 24 uniformed police officers stood in a line outside the prison walls during the execution. When the announcement came, they walked in silence. The little-known footnote to this case: when authorities processed the sporting goods store robbery, they found that the group had taken so many firearms, 44 weapons, that they literally could not carry all of them. They left some behind. George Rivas, a man imprisoned for most of his adult life, had briefly controlled an arsenal larger than most rural police departments.
Number 4. Kenneth Allen McDuff. His last words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." In a story full of chilling details, that sentence may be the most disturbing of all, because the state of Texas had already released Kenneth McDuff once before, and when they did, people died. McDuff was born on March 21, 1946, in Rosebud, Texas, the fifth of 6 children in a family where discipline came unevenly and indulgence came often. His mother, Addie, known around town as the pistol-packing mama for her habit of carrying a firearm and threatening anyone who crossed her family, reportedly shielded her son from consequences throughout his childhood. McDuff grew up with a hair-trigger temper, a deep-seated contempt for authority, and an escalating pattern of cruelty that local residents noticed long before the criminal record did. His first capital offense came in August of 1966. McDuff and an accomplice abducted 3 California teenagers who were visiting family in Texas: Robert Brand, his cousin Marcus Dunham, and Marcus's 16-year-old girlfriend Edna Louise Sullivan. The 2 young men were shot. Sullivan was raped, tortured, and strangled using a broomstick. The method of her killing gave McDuff the name that would follow him for the rest of his life. McDuff's accomplice, guilt-stripped from the next morning, turned himself in and agreed to testify. McDuff was convicted and sentenced to death 3 times over for 3 counts of murder. He sat on Texas death row from 1968 forward. Then, in 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Furman v. Georgia that existing death penalty statutes were unconstitutional. Overnight, every death sentence in America was commuted. McDuff's death sentences became life sentences, and the Texas prison system, struggling with severe overcrowding throughout the 1980s, began quietly releasing inmates early. Kenneth McDuff walked out of prison on parole in October 1989. Within weeks, a woman's body was found 3 days after his release. She was never officially connected to McDuff, though investigators later looked hard at the timeline. What is documented is that between 1989 and 1992, McDuff raped and murdered at least 6 more women, and possibly as many as 8. His victims included women struggling with addiction, a pregnant convenience store employee taken from her workplace at night, and a young woman who simply accepted a ride.
McDuff was eventually identified, profiled on America's Wanted, and recognized by a Kansas City resident who called the police. He had been living under a false name and working in waste management. Arrested on May 4, 1992, he went to trial, was convicted of capital murder again, and received his 2nd death sentence, the only person in Texas history to have traveled that complete circuit. His execution was scheduled for November 17, 1998. In the days leading up to it, investigators made one final push. They wanted to know the location of Colleen Reed, a young woman McDuff had abducted in 1991, whose body had never been found. McDuff, knowing his time had run out, agreed to lead them to her remains in exchange for being first in line to see the prison dentist. On October 6, 1998, 6 weeks before his execution, investigators found Colleen Reed's skeletal remains in a shallow grave in rural Falls County, Texas. His death directly triggered a complete overhaul of the Texas criminal justice system, new sentencing guidelines, new parole restrictions, and what became known collectively as the McDuff Laws. The overcrowded prison system that had freed him was rebuilt from the ground up at what was then the largest single expenditure for prison construction in Texas state history. The unanswered question that has haunted investigators for decades. McDuff was paroled in 1989. Between then and his 1992 arrest, there are windows of time and bodies that have never been definitively resolved. The official confirmed count is 9 victims. Investigators have long believed the true number is higher. They may never know by how much.
Number 3. Angel Maturino Resendiz. He told psychiatrists he could not be executed, not because of legal appeals or procedural grounds, but because he believed with apparent sincerity that he was half man and half angel, immortal, beyond the reach of lethal injection. "I know the body is going to go to waste," he said, after a Houston judge ruled him mentally competent to face execution.
But me, as a person, I'm eternal. I'm going to be alive forever. On the night of June 27, 2006, the state of Texas tested that belief. Angel Matorino Reséndiz was born Ángel Leoncio Reyes Reséndiz on August 1, 1959 or 1960, even his birth year is disputed, in Izúcar de Matamoros, Mexico. His early life was marked by extraordinary trauma. His mother never married his father and frequently subjected him to physical abuse. At age 6, he was sent to live with a maternal uncle who sexually assaulted him. He ran away from home at 11. By his teenage years, he was living on the streets, surviving and disappearing across the U.S.-Mexico border with a facility that would define his criminal method for the next 3 decades. Reséndiz entered the United States illegally dozens of times, by some estimates, over 100. He was apprehended, deported, and returned so consistently that he became, in retrospect, a catastrophic failure of border enforcement systems. He traveled not by car or bus, but freight train, stowing away in boxcars, riding the rail lines across the country, killing near the tracks, then vanishing back into the rail system before investigators could close in. His known murders span multiple states and stretch from the mid-1990s through 1999. He targeted people who lived near railroad lines, selecting them apparently at random, entering their homes at night and killing them with whatever object was at hand: a sledgehammer, a pickaxe, a bronze statuette. He sexually assaulted many of his female victims. Cars taken from victims were consistently found abandoned in San Antonio, suggesting a regular escape route back toward the border. The murder for which he was ultimately convicted and executed was December 16, 1998. Dr. Claudia Benton was a clinical geneticist at Baylor College of Medicine. She lived with her husband and twin daughters in West University Place, a quiet Houston neighborhood, approximately a quarter mile from a set of Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. Her family had traveled to Arizona for the week. She stayed home alone to prepare a medical presentation scheduled for the following morning.
Reséndiz entered through an unlocked door sometime after midnight. Claudia Benton was killed in her own home. A fingerprint match on the steering column of her stolen Jeep, recovered in San Antonio, identified a name investigators had encountered before: Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, one of many aliases used by a man the FBI was beginning to track across several states. By the summer of 1999, the FBI's most wanted list had a new name on it. A nationwide manhunt was underway. Then something unexpected. Reséndiz's sister, living in the United States, made contact with a Texas Ranger named Drew Carter. She believed her brother could be persuaded to surrender. A deal was negotiated. On July 13, 1999, Angel Matorino Reséndiz walked across the International Bridge at El Paso from Mexico and handed himself to authorities. He was tried in Houston, found guilty, and sentenced to death. During his years on death row, he claimed divine identity, told psychiatrists he was a messenger of God, and stated repeatedly that execution was simply not possible for a being of his nature. A competency hearing in 2006 concluded otherwise. At his execution, Reséndiz spoke directly to the family members of victims gathered in the witness room. His last recorded words, "I want to ask if it is in your heart to forgive me. You don't have to. I know I allowed the devil to rule my life. I don't deserve to cause you pain. You did not deserve this. I deserve what I am getting." What has never been fully resolved, the FBI linked Reséndiz to at least 15 murders in the United States. Some investigators believe the number may be as high as 23, with additional killings in Mexico. Because he traveled under multiple aliases, crossed borders at will, and targeted strangers with no prior connection, the true scope of his crimes may never be established.
Somewhere along the rail lines of America, there may be cases that were never connected and never will be. Number 2. Carla Faye Tucker. The world was watching. More than 500 people gathered outside the Walls unit that night. 25 media satellite trucks lined the streets of Huntsville. Pope John Paul II had appealed for her life. So had the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, a sitting Italian Prime Minister, and the World Council of Churches. Even Pat Robertson, one of the most prominent conservative voices in America, had publicly called for mercy. None of it worked. And the reason Carla Faye Tucker sits at number 2 on this list has nothing to do with the international debate her case ignited. It has everything to do with what she did on the night of June 13, 1983, and the documented fact that by her own account, she enjoyed it. Tucker was born in Houston, Texas on November 18, 1959, the youngest of 3 sisters. Her home life was defined by instability and early exposure to adult vices. Her parents divorced when she was 10. She later claimed she began smoking marijuana at age 8, started using harder drugs by her early teens, and was working as a prostitute by the time she was 14, with the knowledge of her mother. By her late teens, Carla Faye Tucker was deeply embedded in the Houston drug scene, subsisting on methamphetamine, heroin, and a social world built entirely around violence. In the early hours of June 13, 1983, Carla Faye Tucker and her boyfriend, Daniel Ryan Garrett, broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean, a man Tucker had a personal grievance against. The plan, as later reconstructed, was robbery. What happened inside was something else entirely. Dean was beaten to death. Then, when Tucker discovered a woman named Deborah Thornton hiding in the apartment, a woman Tucker had never met who simply had the misfortune of being there, Tucker went to the garage, found a pickaxe, and returned. Both victims were killed. Tucker later told investigators, and eventually told the media, that she had experienced something she struggled to describe, a kind of physical pleasure with each strike, a sensation she had never felt before. The admission was not extracted under pressure. She volunteered it.
The investigation was not complex. Tucker and Garrett had been seen near the scene. Physical evidence connected them directly. Both were arrested in June 1983. Garrett died in prison before his own execution date arrived. Tucker went to trial in 1984, was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder, and was sentenced to death. Then something happened that no prosecutor, no warden, and no legal scholar had fully anticipated. Carla Faye Tucker became a Christian. Not as a legal maneuver, or at least that was never proven. By all documented accounts, including the testimony of the Huntsville prison warden himself, Carla Faye Tucker underwent a genuine transformation behind bars. She became a counselor to other inmates. She married the prison chaplain's assistant. She built a reputation over 14 years on death row as a woman who had fundamentally changed. The warden testified before the parole board that she was a model prisoner, that she had been reformed, that he believed she was no longer the person who committed those murders. The board voted to deny clemency anyway. Governor George W. Bush declined to issue a reprieve. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected 2 separate last-minute appeals. On February 3, 1998, Carla Faye Tucker was transported to the Huntsville unit. Her last meal was a banana, some peach slices, and a garden salad. Her final words expressed love for the people in the room and quiet faith in what she believed waited on the other side. She was pronounced dead at 6:45 p.m. In the witness room, James Thornton, the husband of Deborah Thornton, Tucker's second victim, watched the execution. As the lethal injection began to take effect, he reportedly spoke quietly toward the window. "Here she comes, baby doll. She's all yours." The moral question Carla Faye Tucker put before the American justice system has never been resolved.
If the person who committed the crime no longer exists, truly, verifiably, by all observable measure, who exactly is being executed? 14 years on death row. The warden himself said she had changed, and the needle went in anyway.
Number 1. Henry Lee Lucas.
He confessed to killing 600 people. He described the crimes in extraordinary detail. He named locations, provided evidence, explained methods. And law enforcement across the country believed him, closing hundreds of cold cases based on his word alone. The problem, he couldn't have committed most of them, and he knew it. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in Blacksburg, Virginia, to conditions that produced, if not an excuse, then at least an explanation for the severity of what followed. His mother, Viola, was an alcoholic who prostituted herself in their home, sometimes in front of her children. His father, Anderson, was a legless railroad worker who froze to death in the snow when Henry was a child. Lucas later claimed he was forced to watch his mother's work, beaten frequently, denied medical care when a severe eye infection went untreated until the eye had to be removed, leaving him with a glass eye that became part of his unsettling public image. He was confirmed for 3 murders. His mother, Viola Lucas, stabbed to death in 1960 in a dispute that ended with Lucas's hands around her throat. Frida, Becky Powell, a young woman with an intellectual disability whom he had taken under his care and later killed in 1982. And Kate Rich, an elderly woman in Texas who trusted him and died for it. These 3 murders are confirmed by physical evidence, witnesses, and Lucas's own consistent admission, even after he recanted everything else. The mass confession operation began in 1983, shortly after Lucas was arrested in Texas on an unrelated weapons charge. The moment the cell door closed, he started talking, and talking, and talking. Investigators from across the country flew to Texas. The Lucas Task Force, a Texas Ranger-led operation, facilitated the confessions, connecting Lucas to murders in dozens of states. At the height of the confessions, Lucas claimed responsibility for approximately 600 killings. Many of these confessions were immediately suspicious to outside investigators. Lucas described crimes in states he had never demonstrably visited. He confessed to murders that had already been solved with other convicted perpetrators. Work records placed him hundreds of miles from the scenes on the dates he claimed to have been there. In one particularly stark case, he confessed to a 1979 Texas murder for which he received a death sentence, the victim known only as Orange Socks, at a time when his payroll records showed him working as a roofer in Florida.
A Dallas Times-Herald investigation in 1985 began methodically dismantling the confessions. A subsequent inquiry by the Texas Attorney General concluded that Lucas was what investigators called a fabulist, a pathological liar who had constructed an elaborate hoax, feeding investigators exactly the details they needed to hear. The task force, critics argued, had shown photographs to Lucas before questioning him, brought him to crime scenes before asking him to describe them, and in some cases essentially coached confessions without realizing or caring that they were doing so. Hundreds of solved cases were quietly reopened. The full damage has never been comprehensively tallied. In 1998, 6 days before his scheduled execution at the Walls Unit for the Orange Socks murder, Governor George W. Bush, who had never previously granted a reprieve, commuted Lucas's death sentence to life in prison. It was the only commutation Bush granted in his tenure as governor. The evidence, he concluded, was simply too unreliable to execute a man on. Lucas died in prison on March 12, 2001, of congestive heart failure. He was 64 years old. He was buried in the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery in Huntsville, Texas, the same grounds where many of the men he claimed to have killed alongside were interred.
The truly unresolvable question at the center of the Henry Lee Lucas case is not how many people he killed. It is this: somewhere in the record, among the hundreds of cases his confessions touched, there may be real killers who were never pursued because Lucas had already solved the case. There may be victims whose families received false answers. There may be murderers who are still alive today, free, because a one-eyed drifter in a Texas cell gave investigators the closure they were looking for. Henry Lee Lucas may have been one of the least prolific serial killers in American criminal history, or he may have been one of the most. The truth is locked inside a story that was deliberately designed by Lucas himself to never be fully untangled.